The war on Yemen, where oil and geopolitics mix. Pentagon's not so hidden bloody hands, not eager to reveal their roles in another illegal war on another sovereign country. The U.S. and undoubtedly several of its NATO allies have decided to keep low profiles in the attack on Yemen. This is why Washington has opted to publicly present itself as only providing logistical and intelligence support to the Saudis for the war on Yemen. The war on Yemen, however, would not be possible without the U.S. in the war. Observers should recall how Washington deceptively claimed that it did not want to go to war with the Libyan Arab Jamahira in 2011. The U.S. publicly let the British and French take the lead in the NATO war on Tripoli, while the Pentagon was actually the main force behind the war. U.S. President Barack Obama called this a strategy of leading from behind. The U.S. strategy in Yemen is not too different from that of the NATO war on Libya. It is another case of cloak and dagger where the U.S. does not want to be seen pulling the strings behind the aggression and violation of international law. The Saudis would never have dared attack Yemen without Washington's green light or help on Yemen. This is why it should not come as a surprise that Saudi Arabia used Washington as the platform to announce the launching of its war on Yemen. The AP even noticed the weird podium that the kingdom had selected. In an unusual tableau, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States announced the rare military operation by his country at a Washington news conference about a half hour after the bombing began, the AP reported on March 25th. Double standards. Remember Euromaidan in Ukraine? One ugly double standard after another ugly double standard sticks out. While the House of Saud argued that it has intervened militarily in Yemen to restore Abdi Ruba Mansour al-Hadi, who Riyadh claims is the legitimate president of Yemen, it has pushed for a war on Syria and worked with the U.S. to topple Bashar Assad's government. Washington's reaction is even more lopsided. When Euromaidan was underway in Kiev and Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was forced to flee in 2014, the U.S. and its allies claimed that Yanukovych had lost all legitimacy because he fled Ukraine. Even as recently as February 2015, U.S. officials have maintained this argument. Well, let's all refresh ourselves on the facts here. Former President Yanukovych abdicated his responsibilities by fleeing Kiev during a political crisis. The U.S. Department of State spokesperson Jennifer Psaki told reporters during a press briefing. Well, Mr. al-Hadi also fled his country. Nevertheless, the same measuring stick that was used in Ukraine is not applied to assess al-Hadi's legitimacy, unlike its position on Ukraine. Washington claims that al-Hadi is still the legitimate leader of Yemen. The U.S. is even willing to put aside its differences and work with Sudan, which the U.S. Department of State claims is a state sponsor of terrorism, to bomb Yemen into accepting al-Hadi back. The basis for all these contradictory positions is really a marker of U.S. interests and Machiavellianism. It has nothing to do with legitimacy, democracy, or human rights. To petropolitics and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another war for control of oil. The geopolitical significance of Yemen is weighed heavily in the equation. This war is as much about oil as it is about Saudi suzerainty and the House of Saud's objectives to make Yemen a vassal state. Alongside Djibouti, Yemen forms part of an important maritime choke point called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, also known as the Gateway of Tears, Anguish, which connects the Indian Ocean's Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. It is no exaggeration to call the Mandeb Strait one of the world's arteries. As a maritime choke point, the strait is just as important as Egypt's Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. Because Bab el-Mandeb overlooks one of the most strategic and important global corridors for the transportation of energy and international commerce. Preventing U.S. and Saudi rivals from gaining a strategic foothold over the Mandeb Strait and the Gulf of Aden is a major objective of the war on Yemen. The U.S. and the House of Saud see control over the Mandeb Strait and the Gulf of Aden as strategically important in the scenario of a conflict with Iran, where Tehran closes the Strait of Hormuz to oil shipments and international shipping. As the New York Times points out, nearly all Saudi commerce is via sea, and direct access to the Arabian Sea would diminish dependence on the Persian Gulf, and fears of Iran's ability to cut off the Strait of Hormuz. Plan B in such a scenario for the kingdom includes using Aden and other Yemeni ports. Support for the Balkanization of Yemen chimes with this, and ideas about dividing Yemen have been floating around since the Arab Spring. In 2013, the New York Times had this to propose about a Saudi takeover and annexation of southern Yemen. Arabs are abuzz about part of South Yemen's eventually merging with Saudi Arabia. Most Southerners are Sunni, as is most of Saudi Arabia. Many have family in the kingdom. The poorest Arabs, Yemenis, could benefit from Saudi riches. In turn, Saudis would gain access to the Arabian Sea for trade, diminishing dependence on the Persian Gulf and fear of Iran's virtual control over the Strait of Hormuz. Houthi control over Yemen, however, complicates and obscures U.S. and Saudi plans. As Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah has rightly pointed out, the Houthis and the Yemeni military are capable of closing the Mandeb Strait. One of the reasons that Saudi ambassador to Washington, Adel al-Jubeir, stressed that the Houthis should not have control over ballistic missiles, heavy military hardware, and Yemeni bases is because the U.S. and Saudi Arabia want to neutralize the potential of Yemen to close the Mandeb Strait, especially if Yemen should coordinate with Tehran as an Iranian ally in the future. In this regard, the Saudis have attacked Yemen's missile depots. The aim of the airstrikes include not only preventing Yemen's missile arsenal from being used to retaliate against any exertions of Saudi force, but to also prevent them from being on hand to a Yemeni government aligned to Tehran or other U.S. rivals. Moreover, it has to be remembered that control over Yemen is not only important for mitigating the effects from a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz are closed by Tehran. Control over Mandeb Strait is also important for tightening the noose around the Iranians and in the scenario of a war with Iran. The same can be argued about a U.S. strategy in the Indian Ocean against the Chinese. Back in 2011, when Russia's Deputy Minister Dmitry Rogozin was serving in Brussels as Moscow's envoy to NATO, he noted that Washington was not only planning on taking over Syria as a beachhead for a war with Iran, but that the U.S. and its allies would later try to control Yemen as the next step in preparing the grounds for an attack on Iran. At the same time, RIA Novosti, now renamed Sputnik, reported that Rogozin agreed with the opinion expressed by some experts that Syria and later Yemen could be NATO's last steps on the way to launch an attack on Iran. Reports that Israel, Kenite-occupied Israel, that is to say, is a not-so-secret member of the Saudi-led coalition that is bombing Yemen need to be read, understood, analyzed in the above context about the Mandeb Strait too. Netanyahu's unspoken concern is that Yemen could cut off Israel's access to the Indian Ocean, and more specifically, its ability to easily deploy its Dolphin-class submarines to the Iranian coast and the Persian Gulf. According to the Sunday Times and the Kenite-occupied Israeli sources, 3 nuclear-armed Israeli quote-unquote submarines are deployed near Iran's shores at all times, waiting on standby for orders from Tel Aviv to bomb Iran. In part, this is why Netanyahu was ringing the alarm bells about Yemen and the Mandeb Strait in the Washington Beltway when he went to speak on Capitol Hill on March 4th. Israel is concerned about Yemen because an independent Yemeni government could inhibit their nuclear-armed submarines from easily deploying from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf to menace Iran. Just like the case with Ukraine, all the problems in Yemen are also being blamed on a nearby country. While Russia has been blamed as the scapegoat for the plethora of problems in Ukraine, Iran has been blamed for the Saudi war on Yemen. The Saudis are falsely depicting the Houthis as Iran proxies or allies because the movement is composed of Zaidi Fiver Shiites. The Houthis, however, are independent from Tehran and have agency as political actors. They are not Iranian proxies whatsoever. A common faith has not brought the Houthis and the Iranians, who are predominantly Jafari, Twelver Shiites, together. Politics is what has brought the two together. The sectarian language that falsely depicts Yemen as a battleground between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims is ill-informed or intended to mislead people by design about the actual politics and history of Yemen. This type of sectarian language was never used when the House of Saud supported King Mohammed al-Badir Zaidi Imamate against the Republicans, or Ali Abdullah Saleh, who himself is a Zaidi Shiite, against the Houthis. Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah is very accurate when he points out that different regional players are turning to Tehran for help because either Saudi Arabia will not help them or is pushing them in the direction of Iran through its foolish policies. This has been precisely the case for the Houthis. If it was not for the flawed policies of the US and Saudi Arabia, the Houthis would never have turned to Iran in the first place.
Things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you.